This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So, the time has come at last to say a few words about the Altissimo Poeta, about Dante, whose name has cropped up during the afternoon on several occasions. And it's appropriate that at the end of a conference like this, that we pause over Dante the Divina Commedia, because here is a work presupposing at every point prayer and prayerfulness as a condition of the soul's journey into God. Now, what we shall do here is something very straightforward. The paper is not very long. I think it may be too brief, in fact. What we shall do is to say a few preliminary remarks about Dante and prayerfulness and the prayerful status of the Divina Commedia. Then I will establish a context, a narrative and ideological context for the two exquisite prayer movements that there are in the Divina Commedia. Dante's version of the Lord's Prayer at the beginning of Purgatory 11, and then, as already mentioned, Stefano mentioned earlier, in fact quoted from it, the exquisite prayer to the Virgin on the threshold of the final canto, Canto 33. I'm not breaking any new ground here, there are no new radical ideas. The whole idea is simply to create a context for us to look at these poems, and I shall read the poems in their entirety, the prayers in their entirety in Italian at the end. When I've reached the end of the prayer at the beginning of Canto 33, you will know that's it, we shall be finished. And you have a handout there and a translation to help you through this. So, a brief paper then on the wonderful prayer moments that there are in Dante. Now, straight away we run into a bit of a problem here, because the Comedia, which at every point presupposes an attitude of prayer for the completion of the journey which it describes, the Comedia does not, on the face of it, commend itself as a particularly prayerful poem. It's prophetic, most certainly it's prophetic, but it's not particularly prayerful. It's too angry for this. It's too busy about bringing the world to its senses. On one hand, there are the superiores, the magnates, the princes, the prelates, the popes, the emperors, all of whom are called upon to guarantee the peace and the quiet which is necessary for man's proper coming about as man, and to lead him on to pastures new, but who have left him instead to his own devices, ungoverned, unnourished, untutored, something close to his annihilation. On the other hand, there are the inferiores, the ordinary pilgrim spirits, who, having a hazy perception, a vague perception of what it might be like to be in, through and for God, they have instead opted for the alternative project. They've delivered themselves in full consciousness of what they're doing to something other than what might be. They've delivered themselves to something less than the kind of self-transcendence on the planes of knowing and loving, the kind of self-transcendence which in Dante's view is properly theirs as the most immanent of their immanent possibilities. So the Comedia is an angry poem. It's a poem which is conceived and articulated in pro del mondo che mal vive, over and against the world which has lost its way, and stands in need of prayer. Certainly it stands in need in prayer, but of prayer as mediated by way of prophecy and of outspokenness. Now, this is not to say that prayer in Dante is not there in the poem. On the contrary, prayer is there, and it's there in abundance, as the mood and as the condition of man's proper being and becoming as man. So the souls in purgatory, they are everywhere at prayer. Prayer being a fundamental disposition of the spirit in this part of the poem, in the Purgatorio. And then there are the souls in paradise, who are similarly and incessantly engaged in an act of thanksgiving, of praise and of gratitude. Their whole existence, the souls in the Paradiso, their whole existence being in that sense a matter of prayer and of prayerfulness writ large. More than this, the Comedia has, as I mentioned, two of the most exquisite prayer moments in our literature. I'm incredibly biased about this. They are very beautiful indeed. Namely, Dante's version of the Lord's Prayer in Purgatorio 11, which is gently appropriated by way of a sort of interlinear gloss. We'll see it when we come to the text in a moment. Gently interiorized as the penitent spirits on the terrace of the proud struggle to assert the humble over the hubristic self. And then there is Bernard of Clairvault's prayer of intercession at the beginning of Paradiso 33, which is designed to secure the pilgrim poet, Dante himself, as a journeying soul, in a sense of the grace whereby he is able at last to move into God as a matter emphatically, not of self-losing, but of self-finding, of discovering self in the fullness of its own humanity. So this is what I'm saying to you. What I'm saying is that prayer is everywhere there in the poem. It's there in the purgatorial at any rate, and in the paradisal phase of the poem, not much in the infernal phase. It's everywhere discernible as the mood of being in its travail, the purgatorial moment of the text, and in its triumph, the paradisal moment of the text. But, and this is the preliminary point that I'm making to you, it is there, as I would say, as a matter less of meta-literary than of literary interest. It's there, in other words, not at any rate in any explicit or otherwise conspicuous fashion, as an aspect of the poem's conception and articulation precisely as such, but rather as a matter of thematic concern, as entering into the poet as just one feature or dimension of the issues that it raises along the way. Now I have to say, I say this with a bit of a heavy heart here, because it seems to me that what our conference has been about, and indeed what it should be about, is the relationship of poetry and prayer as a principle, rather than as a product of literary undertaking, as a point of departure for that undertaking, rather than something apt to sustain it from beforehand or from within itself. But even in one who is as forthcoming as Dante is, in respect of the problematics of his own existence, and Dante is a confessional poet. All his works, each successive work, the Vita Nova, the Convivio, the De Vulgari Eloquentia, the Comedia itself, they all arise from, and they all seek to address, the tensions which Dante discerned at the centre of his own existence. It was a very troubled existence. Even in one as forthcoming as Dante in that sense, there is no seeing into a man's soul beyond what he himself is prepared to allow. Hence our concern in the next few minutes, not with the text in the round as a prayer utterance, but with the prayer moments contained by the text. But they are exemplary, they are exquisite. They're exemplary in their combination of piety and of poetic attentiveness. Now, Paul Tillich, who understood very well what was going on in Dante, you often find that great philosophers and theologians understand what is going on better in Dante than Dantes themselves do. Paul Tillich, who understood very well what is going on in Dante, spoke of the Comedia as entering the, quote, the deepest as well as the highest places of courage and salvation, and as offering, he says, in poetic symbols an all-embracing existential doctrine of man. Well, good on him, he's exactly right. That's what needs to be said. Both parts of the formula, the deepest and the highest places part, and the poetic symbols part, are quite correct. Dante's seriousness as a philosophical and as a theological spirit are matched only by the kind of imaginative genius, whereby metaphor, which had been hitherto a sort of contrivance, a matter of convenientia, whereby metaphor becomes a matter in the hands of the master of well-nigh proper predication. That's the way we do theology. Indispensable to the theological project conceived in the existential way. What I mean by that, in the existential way, is the theological project as set up by way not of the idea pure and simple, not of the proposition pure and simple, but of the predicament of the one who is lost to himself and to the reasons of his being in the world. That is where Dante begins his poem. He begins his poem by saying, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita. I found myself lost in the midst of a dark wood. There's no propositionalism here. There is a grim phenomenology, a predicament. The story is straightforward, and most of you probably know it, but for those of you who are unfamiliar with the text, shame on you if you are. Those of you who are unfamiliar with the text, the story is very straightforward. Dante, as a protagonist in his own poem, finds himself lost in a dark wood. And he's threatened by three beasts, a lion, a leopard, and a wolf, all intensely allegorical. And they are standing between him and the sunlit uplands beyond the valley. He catches sight of a shadowy figure in the depths of the forest, and he pleads after the manner of the psalmist, miserere me. He pleads for assistance, for help. He discovers as he does so that the figure before him is Virgil, who advises him that there is no easy way out. Rather, what is required is a roundabout journey, a journey down into the pit, up across the terraces of Mount Purgatory, the Antipodes of Jerusalem. You've got a little diagram there on the handout to show how. Remember that it's a geocentric world, and that the earth with its Jerusalem Antipodes is enclosed at the centre. To the shores of Mount Purgatory, therefore, and then away across the circling spheres of the Empyrean. Until at last he comes into the presence, the immediate presence of God himself. Now the imagery of all this, and certainly as far as the first canticle is concerned, the Inferno, is famously monstrous. Rivers of blood, pools of feces, severed limbs, entrails galore, variously scabrous forms in the murky air. And with it, the cacophony and the stench of it all. Making his way in the company of Virgil down through the circles of, and he's got a diagram there as well, down through the circles of intemperance, of violence, and finally of fraudulence as for Dante, the most heinous of moral options in human experience. Making his way down, he speaks along the way with any number of the reprobate. His conversation covers matters of a personal kind, of a political kind, and as far as these second things are concerned, the political kind, ecclesiastical as well, because popes and prelates are pretty well represented in this part of the poem. Finally, he reaches the bottom of the pit, where the inane flapping of Satan's wings, of Satan's bat-like, his ribby wings, grisly. That's the only movement there. Everything else is still. An image of what? An image of lifelessness, of lovelessness, of the perfect annihilation, the perfect stilling of everything that matters in human experience. Everything at the bottom of the pit is still. Nothing moves. He clambers down over the hideous and very quickly, ridiculously upside down shanks of Satan, because we're moving now from the northern to the southern hemisphere. He clambers down the shanks of Satan. He and Virgil make their way through a winding tunnel, it's on the diagram that you've got there, at last to emerge on the shores of Mount Purgatory, at the Antipodes of Jerusalem. And there's a vast seascape and a skyscape, and it all contrasts so wonderfully with the darkness, with the claustrophobia, with the issuelessness of the pit, the going nowhere-ness of the pit. No one in hell is going anywhere. Here, on the shores of Purgatory, he is met by the fearsome figure of Cato, the Cato of Utica, Cato of Utica, who gave his life in the name and for the sake of freedom, emancipation. And the Purgatory has everything to do with that. And having lingered for a moment, and I put this clause in for the benefit of Stefano. He's here somewhere, it's Stefano here. Yes, there he is, yes, well, you know what I'm about to say. He lingers for a moment in the company of his dear friend and musician Casella. Yes, and the song is so sweet, Virgil and all the company, Virgil down to the whole company, are transfixed by the beauty of it all. Cato appears, but nonetheless, Che spiriti lenti, what is this, you laggardly souls? And he moves them on to the mountain. Because this is a place brooking no delay. Everyone is on the move here. There is no looking back in respect to the business in hand. First, stop on the lower terraces of the mountain, come what Dante calls the anti-purgatorio, the moment of thoughtfulness. Spiritual cleansing is a preeminently thoughtful business. The moment of thoughtfulness, preparatory to the rigours of Purgatory proper. And then comes Purgatory proper, the moment in which, having taken the guilt of self into self, the soul embarks on the process of self-cleansing, of bringing home the randomly and potentially wayward loving generated by the world round about to the kind of love, Dante thought, given with the act itself of existence, to the inbuilt love, to the connatural love, the connatural thirst for God, which Dante thought is present to man from the outset as a fundamental principle of self-interpretation. You understand what I'm saying there? The difference between purgatory and hell is precisely the fact that no one in hell says, I'm sorry. No one says, I am guilty. Everyone in hell, read it for yourself, it's all there in the text. Everyone blames everyone else, not self. There is no taking of guilt into self. But once the soul has taken guilt into itself, then there is the possibility of new life. However heinous their sinfulness, there is the possibility of resurrection. Once the soul has said, I am sorry, I am guilty. That is the difference between the Inferno and the Purgatorio. Dante knows exactly what he's doing here. With what amounts, in the sense that I've described then, to a reorganization of self on the plane of loving. All the loves generated by the world are brought home to the love which is given with the act of existence itself. Everything is harmonized with the soul's thirst for God. With that reconfiguration of self, then the way is open for an ascent of the spirit. For an ascent of the spirit, for a movement of self into God, there to discover self in all its power to transcendence, in all its power to the most ecstatic kind of over and beyondness. That is what the Paradiso is about. The Paradiso is about the soul embarking on its tremendous power. Dante thought, my goodness, he had such a positive conception of human nature. That we are always in a position to affirm ourselves over and beyond ourselves. No ulterior affirmation, no selfhood. We are always moving on beyond self to affirm ourselves in the over and beyondness, the ulteriority of self. We are always ahead of ourselves. We are always called on in every moment to do something other and something greater than self. And that is what is happening in paradise. That is what the Paradiso is about. So the soul embarks on the ascent of the spirit, and it begins to come close to God himself. And he sees, first of all, the spirit sees, first of all, a simple light. A simple light in which the substance and the accidents of all things are gathered together, fused together. And then that light opens out in terms of a kind of threefoldness. The symbolism is quite obvious, isn't it? And then mirabile dictu, imprinted on that threefoldness, or on the central circle of that threefoldness, is what? Imprinted there is our likeness, la nostra fige. There impressed on the second circle is our likeness. Well, this clearly, to complete the story, this coalescence of the many and the one, of the divine and the human within the simplicity of the whole, is all too much for the mind. It surpasses all understanding. Incomprehension, however, takes flight, as in the last lines of the poem, the pilgrim is overcome by a sense of the love substance, the love intensity of it all, of the love which moves the sun and the other stars. Beautiful, beautiful line with which the poem finishes. The love, therefore, love, amore. Dante is the world's great love poet. He was my word, he was an arch-intellectual by the time. He lived by ideas, and he knew his philosophers. But Dante is first and foremost a love poet. He is the world's great love poet. The Vita Nuova has as its first great canzone, Donne che avete intelletto d'amore. All Dante's works have to do with the intelletto d'amore, with the understanding of love as the dynamic principle in human experience, the principle of relationship, the principle of moving out to lay hold of the final good, the supreme good. So love is understood by Dante to be, this is a rule of thumb, this is the way to understand Dante. Love is understood by him to be the ultimate irreducible. That is the ultimate certainty, the ultimate ontological referent. Everything in Dante is reducible, referable to love understanding. So we've got a story through three realms of the next life. The journey is depicted there, and it depicts in the way that I described to you the three moments. First of all, we have the plight of those who are called to be in, through, and for God, but they opt instead for the way of self-celebration. They opt for the way of self-idolatry. All the souls in hell are worshippers of themselves, in one way or another. They are all self-idolaters. They know themselves in the celebration of self, and as a consequence of that, because of the fragility of self, because they are at the centre of their universe, they know themselves in the fragility of that and ultimately in the despair of that. Dante depicts, in addition to that, the struggle of those who, in the way I've described to you, take the guilt of self into self as the first step towards its liquidation. That is the first step towards the liquidation of guilt. They embark on the way of a love configuring in the light of that, in the way that I described. And then in the Paradiso moment of the poem, we have the bliss of those who have emerged as king and bishop over themselves. Dante says at the end of Purgatory 27, king and bishop over themselves. My goodness, this has tremendous implications in the area of ecclesiology. Yes? The soul is in charge of itself. That is the way of adult Christianity. The soul moves into a state of spiritual self-possession. And Virgil says, it's in the text, read it for yourself. Purgatory 27, the last line, I crown you king and bishop over yourself. And the soul is then it's in a position of ontological, moral self-determination. It is a very adult poem. The Divine Comedy is not a poem for adolescents. It is a poem which treats of the conditions of what it is to be grown up, an adult in charge of self, king and bishop over oneself. Now, this is the point I'm making to you now. All this refers to the next life. It's anagogical. Anagogical means referring to what goes on in the next life, and that's what's going on at the literal level. But you and I know, as readers of this text, that the Divine Comedy has nothing to do, well, I suppose it has something to do, but not primarily to do with what is going on in the next life. Because Dante knew no more about what is going on in the next life than you or I do. But he knew exactly what is going on in this life. And this poem, the figures, the categories which he uses are those which stand to be applied to and lived out and verified by the individual man and woman here and now. In other words, when Dante looked at human experience here and now, our situation, the situation that we're in this very moment, Dante was inclined to say that, first of all, comes the moment of self-recognition. The moment in which the individual, conscious of the hiatus in self, between the what might be and the what actually is of its presence in the world, in consequence of that, the pilgrim spirit descends into self. It confronts in the recesses of personality its twofold will, to affirmation and to annihilation. My goodness, what complex and irrational creatures we are in the midst of our rationality. Then, in strict dependence on this, comes the purgatorial moment, the moment in which the soul turns back upon itself. It has recognized itself, it reflects, it turns back upon itself in a moment of grieving. Bernard of Clairvaux had a wonderful expression, a beautiful expression for that. An assiduitas lacrimarum. How lovely is that? An assiduitas lacrima, an assiduity of tears. Turning back upon self in an assiduity of tears. And turning back upon itself in a moment of grieving, in a state of grieving, the soul embarks upon the way of renewal, and again by way of all that God has done for man in the moment both of creation and of recreation, creation in the first moments, and of recreation in Christ, it embarks upon the way of resurrection. This then, involving, as it does, a reshaping of self on the plane of loving, is the second phase of our existence here and now. Dante is interrogating the way we are. That is why the Divina Commedia is quite a terrifying poem to read. It confronts self with the predicament that self is in. It lays hold of you, and it never lets you go. Yes? As some of us who've been studying this poem for 30 or 40 years and still feel that we've got a way to go. Yes? It's endlessly taxing. So there is a turning back of self upon self and a redrawing of the limits of selfhood through a commingling of natural moral endeavour and of grace. And then we come to the ecstatic moment. Don't content yourself with reading only the Inferno. People who read only the Inferno get hold of the wrong end of the stick. Because Dante is not the poet of dereliction, of darkness. That darkness, that dereliction, is simply the tragic side of a life and a light in Dante which is magnificent. He's the poet of life and light and love. And the Inferno is the tragic side. You should always start reading the Divine Comedy from the far end. Start with the Paradiso and move back, and that gives you a better view of how it works. Paradiso is, for Dante then, that moment in which, in the way that I've stressed to you, the individual is forever opening out upon the spaciousness of its own humanity. How beautiful is that? It's ever opening up on the transhumanity. Trashumanar is Dante's expression for that. The transhumanity, which is but the intelligible form, the deep substance of its humanity. We are forever called to open out upon the ecstatic substance of our humanity. No opening out on the ecstatic substance of our humanity, no humanity. Dante was the poet of absolute rapture. in this sense. So this, in keeping with what we've been saying over the past few days, or rather yesterday and today about the incarnationalism of all this, is the way that it works. God works out his purposes from within the recesses of human nature, as knowing itself, as reconfiguring itself, as being embarked on the way of transcendence. It's worked out not through the supernatural. Dante has no time for the supernatural, for the terminology of supernaturalism. It's worked out in terms of the natural as empowered from deep within itself by God's intentionality and by his intentionality above all in Christ. The Christ event for Dante is a matter not only of, not even primarily, of propitiation, but of potentiation. So the poem stands to be read in terms not of what comes next. It stands to be read ultimately in terms of what is here and now. That's why we read it. If it only concerned itself with what comes next, we would think, fine, what's next on the agenda? What a splendid imagination this man's got, so what? No. We read it because it is analytical in respect of the situation that we find ourselves in now, a great existential doctrine of man. That is how it's read by all those who are, as the expression is so exquisite, in the Paradiso 7, all those who are mature in the flame of love. Adulto nella fiamma d'amore. That is how it stands to be read. So we have those three moments of our experience here and now. The moment of encounter, the moment of endeavour, and the moment of ecstasis. And it is in this context that prayer comes into its own. It's in this context that Dante dwells on prayer as the mood, as the coefficient, as that whereby we are moved on, whereby we are made new creatures. Prayer is, in this sense, the coefficient. It is the encompassing. It's the whereabouts of new life. And now, in the last few moments of this, but we're going to read the prayers in a minute, we can have a look at the two key passages. The Pater Noster on the threshold of Purgatory 11, and the prayer to the Virgin at the beginning of the final canto of the poem. Now that is Paradiso 33. And they are each of these passages consummate in their sense of the piety of the technical perfection, the piety and the perfection, poetry and prayer, in its rhythm, in its refinement, as an articulation of the Spirit. Take first then the Purgatorio passage, the Lord's Prayer in Purgatorio 11. It's intoned by the spirits, the penitent spirits on the circle of the proud, but in its intoning, it is appropriated. It's drawn into the centre of existence. Prayer stands to be internalized, not simply articulated, but internalized. And it's drawn into the centre of existence as a means of seeing self, structuring self, substantiating self, interpreting self. These souls, these proud men and women, these are souls who, like all those who are lost to the deep reasons of their humanity, they know themselves only in the centrality of themselves to their own universe. That is the infernal condition in Dante. To be in hell is to be at the centre of one's universe, regardless of everything else. It is to locate self at the centre of all that matters. Everyone in hell, the fraudulent, the intemperate, the violent, they are all guilty of that. That is the way they see and understand themselves. They are all at the centre. That is what hell is about then in Dante. As you read over the Inferno, remember that the pains of the travail of hell in any adult reading of the poem has to do not with pain as imposed, as judicially imposed, but as self-imposed. It has to do with the agony which is implicit in the soul's leading preference. The agony of the Inferno is brought upon itself. Therein lies its tragedy. Were it not for that, it wouldn't be a tragic thing. It would be a disaster and a misfortune, but not a tragedy. The grim apparatus of imposition in any adult reading of the poem is neither here nor there. What matters, what is here or there, is the crisis at the centre of existence. The crisis constituted by a man standing over against himself in the forum of conscience. All the souls in hell, they're all central to their universe, but they know they put themselves there, and they know they shouldn't be there. If they didn't know that, it wouldn't be hell. It would be paradise. They have what they wanted. No. They are taxed by the substance of their own conscience. They know what they have done, and that is their torture. Everyone else then in hell is present to the individual, to the person who has lost himself to the reasons of his universe. Everyone else is present to that individual as what? If I'm at the centre of my universe, how do I relate to you and how do you relate to me? If I'm at the centre of my universe, I don't want you on my patch. I don't want to be intimidated. I feel intimidated by you. I feel threatened by you, and you by me if you're at the centre of your universe. We relate by way of resentment, by way of anger. Self as self-centred only ever knows itself in fear, in intimidation. Herein precisely is the grim phenomenology of the Inferno. It's all there in the text. Dante reconstructs a state of mind, a psychopathology of being in its alienation. The soul who is at the centre of his own universe knows himself only in the fragility and the despair of that. And what does Dante have written over the gates of hell? Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate. Abandon all hope, you who enter here. This is the place of ontological, moral, in every conceivable sense, of hopelessness. Inasmuch then as the soul is at the centre, it knows itself by way only of despair. But inasmuch as the individual struggles to reform its love patterns, inasmuch as it struggles by way of an assiduity of tears to constrain itself to what matters and what matters alone, to a being in God as the beginning and end of all being, then it looks upwards and outwards. How beautiful is that? It looks away from self. And that, for Dante, is the content precisely of the prayer which Jesus taught his disciples. That is the prayer par excellence of deflection, of self looking away, of self as present to self by way of the infinitely other than self, of the greater than self. Well, here we go. Let's read it. Follow it through. I read it slowly. Follow it either in the Italian or in the translation. But dwell on it and see the way that Dante articulates and dwells himself on its exquisite substance in the context of hubris and humility. O Padre nostro, che nei cieli stai, non circonscritto, ma per più amore che ai primi effetti di lassù tu hai. Laudato sia il tuo nome, hallowed be thy name. Laudato sia il tuo nome, il tuo valore da ogni creatura, come degno di render grazie al tuo dolce vapore. Venga per noi la pace del tuo regno, thy kingdom come. Venga per noi la pace del tuo regno, che noi ad essa non potendo a noi, se la non viene con tutto nostro ingegno. Come del suo voler gli angeli tuoi fan sacrificio a te, cantando osanna, così facciano gli uomini le suoi. Da oggi a noi la quotidiana manna, give us this day our daily bread, senza la quale per questo aspro deserto a ritrova chi più di gira s'affanna. E come noi lo mal che avem sofferto, perdoniamo a ciascuno. E tu perdona benigno, e non guardar lo nostro merito. Nostra virtù che di legger s'adona non spermentar, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Nostra virtù che di legger s'adona non spermentar con l'antico avversar, ma libera da lui, che si la sprona. Quest'ultima preghiera, Signor caro, già non si fa per noi, che non bisogna, ma per color che dietro noi restaro. So the souls in purgatory who are prayed for, or pray for, how beautiful is that, a kind of exquisite reciprocity, those who live, who remain behind. Well, the model clearly needs no glossing, does it? The Lord's Prayer, as it's set out in the Gospels, is language at its most taught, at its most economic, at its most deeply and powerfully functional, and yet it does need glossing. That's the point. It does need glossing, because it's by way of its glossing, of its proposal and of its re-proposal in the forum of conscience, that it enters into the secret parts of the soul, there to quicken the soul afresh, and to fashion from it a new creation. Hence the reflection, turning back upon thy kingdom come. For short of this, we could never by ourselves attain to it. Give us this day our daily bread, without which those of us who strive most to advance through this barren wilderness are but mere stragglers. Forgive us our trespasses, and look not on our deserving. This, in short, is prayer under the aspect of intentionality, of the archetypal utterance as drawn into the centre of existence, there to shape and to substantiate it from out of the depths. Now we move on to the final movement, the prayer whereby the soul knows itself in the newness of life, prayer we have just looked at, in the now gathered character, and in the fresh directionality of its loving. This is also the prayer whereby the soul projects itself upon its proper ulteriority, upon its over and beyondness. Its power to be, Dante thought, Dante had such a wonderful view, a positive view of human nature despite all. God had made it and God saw that it was good, and Dante saw that it was good, despite all. And this, a man who was living in exile, with all the bitterness of exile, the climbing up and down other people's stairs, the tasting the saltiness of other people's bread. No. It had been made good, God saw that it was good, and Dante here has a sense, an inalienable sense, thoroughly Dantean, of the way in which we are called in some sense to be, in some sense, in some measure to be, secondo alcuna proporzione, after the manner of God himself. It is, I think, impossible to overstate this as a way of seeing and understanding Dante and of coming alongside him as a fellow traveller or a fellow breaker of bread, a companion. That's what the word companion means. Companion, one of the loveliest words in the English language, means a fellow breaker of bread. And the companion is someone you give a bit of your panino to. That's a fellow breaker of bread. And we come alongside him in this way, or we can come alongside him in this way, in this celebratory way. Because in spite of the disgregated character of his own existence, and there's nothing facile about this, Dante's existence was a self-consciously difficult existence. And in spite of the catastrophe of world history around about him, imperial history, ecclesiastical history, civic history, we mustn't romanticize about Dante's times, they were dreadful. In spite of the catastrophe of all this, then there is a call to be somewhat after the manner of God himself. And a call which is facilitated, which is made possible for us by the work, as I said, not so much of propitiation, that's certainly, but not only that, of potentiation in Christ. In Paradiso 7:116, Christ's work was to make man sufficiente, per far all'uomo sufficiente a rilevarsi. Now here is a twist to classical and Augustinian soteriology. Man is called to participate in his own resurrection. Dante's is in this sense everywhere a theology of creation. Each successive moment in God's dealings with man, and above all the moment of the Christ, is taken up for him in the love energy, the love élan of the original and the abiding let it be, fiat. Dante's is a theology of the cross. Of course it's a theology of the cross. How could it not be? All Christian theology is in some sense a theology of the cross. But this is a theology of the cross as subsumed at last, as taken up at last, in a theology of creation and recreation, of a bringing forth and of a sustaining in love of what is in the world as an object of perception and of predilection. And once again, it is prayer. It is prayer that sustains the soul at the point of emergence, of its opening out on the unspeakable spaciousness of its proper humanity. In hell, no spaciousness, just constriction. Something of the course of this we've already noticed, so I'll be brief here. In the wake of the prayer, which we're going to read in a few seconds' time, in the wake of the prayer, what do we see? Well, in the wake of the prayer comes the preliminary glimpse of God in his twofold simplicity and complexity. It's all there in the text. The Godhead as comprehending both substance and accident, the whatness and the howness of things, within a single light, a single volume. I saw there gathered in the depths of it, bound by love, in a single volume, all the leaves scattered through the universe, subject, substance and accidents and their relations, but yet fused in such a manner that what I'm speaking of is a simple light. 3385. But no sooner glimpsed in all its strangeness and all its notional impossibility than the simple light opens out on the three, on a triple configuration of being, present to itself by way of seeing, of understanding, and of rejoicing, of a perichoresis, there's a posh word. It means the mutual indwelling of the three persons. The Latin for that was a mutual in-seatedness. But it's lost the notion of dance, of a mutual indwelling of the three persons of the Trinity. And sometimes I say to the students that you need to write up on your landlord's ceiling, or put on your fridge, or write on the cuff of your shirt, or wherever you write things to remind yourself this tercet, and one or two other key tercets in the Paradiso, which are so exquisitely Dantean. O luce eterna, che sola intesidi, sola t'intendi, e da te intelletta, e intendente te ami, e arridi. O light eternal, who alone abidest in thyself, alone knowest thyself, and known to thyself, and knowing, lovest and smilest on thyself. My goodness, Dante's universe is a riso dell'universo. It's a universe of smiling. Sorridere is fully ontological in Dante. The universe smiles. Truth is smiled forth. Bernard smiles. Beatrice smiles. The truth is articulated smilingly. And that's not trivial. That is in the radiance of that. That is how Dante is. But even that's not all, because in what follows, and in a manner confirming and how beautiful is this, confirming the centrality of the human project to the very life of God himself. God so loves man that he brings him into the center of his own being. Then comes that depiction which I mentioned to you, that inscription, that engraving of our likeness on the very aspect of the Godhead. Dentro da sé del suo colore stesso mi parve vinta della nostra effigie. It seemed to me to be depicted within itself and in its own colour our likeness. How strange. And it's this point that the poet's power to image forth fails him. And his intuition, his poetic power, his poetic energy, as a poesis, as a poet, this gives way to what? Gives way in the way that I described to you to an unqualified sensation of love as, again, the ultimate irreducible. The very last lines of the poem, here power failed, my lofty imagination, but already my desire and my will were turned like a wheel that is evenly moved by the love which moves the sun and the other stars. All'alta fantasia qui lanciava vocevi il mio desiderio ribelle, sì come rota che qualmente mossa, l'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle. The silence. That is the ultimate, the absolute. But the point there is this, that for Dante there can be no ecstasis of the spirit other than in the context of prayer. And the whole experience is sustained from within itself and quickened from within itself by the preliminary prayer at the beginning of that canto. Bernard, therefore, in the twilight moments of the penultimate canto, looks upwards to the rim of the rose, the celestial rose, where the Virgin is seated. And he bids his charge follow very carefully as he intercedes on his behalf. I, Bernard, will pray for you. He seeks, thus Bernard, the Virgin's grace. He seeks her intercession. That's a special way of putting it, not her grace. Her intercession for grace, that he might be brought home to the ultimate moment of intellection. The prayer then, which we're now about to read by way of conclusion to this paper, and I suppose to our conference on prayer and poetry, is in every sense exquisite. It's rooted in, it's transparent to antique and early Christian patterns of doxology. It's rich in from the outset in apostrophe, anaphora, antithesis, paradox. It carefully balances one clause with another within the economy of the hendecasyllable and within the tercet of which the hendecasyllable forms part, the 11-syllable line. All this to produce what? To produce a moment of stillness, a stasis of the spirit, preparatory to its ecstasis, to what follows by way of rapture. First then, in the prayer comes the praise moment of the prayer. It's a hymn to self-effacement, this the self-effacement of the Virgin, and yet to the splendour of the Virgin, to her humility, and yet to her exaltedness. And each of these things turns on its counterpart and points up in this kind of pas de deux, the meaning of its counterpart. Then we have the supplicatory moment, the petitionary moment, no less fervent, Bernard says, than anything he has ever uttered on his own behalf. May the mists of Dante's mortality be dispelled, he says, such that the supreme beauty of the Godhead be with him, be his, now and forevermore. With this, it is done. The Virgin looks momentarily in Dante's direction. He does this time and again in the Paradiso, the glance like the smile, erotically charged, but eros in Dante leads on to the most incredible kind of agapeic intensity. These things are not opposites one of another, they flow on one into another. All love flows on into its greater form and its implementation. And Beatrice and now the Virgin glance in his direction and then glance away. And the glance is unspeakably eloquent. There is ultimate directionality, ultimate focus. I glance, I look away. And the Virgin looks in the direction of Bernard and Dante, and that is confirmation of an absolute kind. Dante has now been made equal, therefore, to his own proper destiny. As all men who come to this position, this state are made equal to their own proper destiny. According to the properties of personality, nothing is lost. Paradiso is as full of eccentric figures, distinct figures, as the Inferno and the Purgatorio. Nothing is lost by way of personality. Everything is fulfilled in the uniqueness of that fulfillment in the presence of God. So, at this point, prayer and poetry, they flow one into the other by way not of abolishing their difference. Dante knows the difference, of course he does. But of confirming the depth and the completeness of their companionship. The prayer is intensified by way of Dante's poetic professionalism. I don't need to mention to you, to reaffirm to you, that Dante was not only a poet, but he was a poet's poet. My word, Dante took this seriously. He wrote, but he thought about writing. All his work from the beginning to the end, represents not only a creative act but a meditation on a creative act. None of this is casual or off the cuff in Dante. It's all through thought out with what one Italian critic calls a serietà terribile, a terrible earnestness, a terrifying earnestness. That is the way Dante was. He was terrifyingly earnest. So poetry and prayer flow together, carefully thought through. They flow one into the other. They confirm in their companionship the depth of both of them, their ultimate, their unity, their joint functionality. Between them, prayer and poetry articulate the deepest yearning of the spirit. So here we go then, beginning at the first line of the last canto, and after that, no more to say. Dante has the last word, which is how it should be. Vergine Madre, figlia del tuo figlio, umile e alta più che creatura, termine fisso l'eterno consiglio. Tu sei colei che l'umana natura nobilitasti sì, che il suo fattore non disdegnò di farsi sua fattura. Nel ventre tuo si raccese l'amore, per cui caldo nell'eterna pace così è germinato questo fiore. Qui se a noi meridiana pace di carità è giusto, intra i mortali, se di speranza fontana e vivace, se di speranza fontana vivace. Donna, sei tanto grande e tanto vali che colvo la grazia e a te non ricorre, sua disianza vuol volare senza ali. La tua benignità non pur soccorre a chi domanda, ma molti fiati liberamente a dimandare precorre. In te misericordia, in te pietate, in te magnificenza, in te s'aduna quantunque in creatura e in bontate. Or questi, che dall'infima lacuna dell'universo infin qui ha vedute le vite spiritali ad una, supplica a te, per grazia, di virtute tanto, che possa con gli occhi levarsi più alto verso l'ultima salute. E io, che mai per mio veder non narsi più ch'io fo per lo suo, tutti i miei prieghi ti porto, e priego che non siano scarsi, perché tu ogni nume li disleghi di sua mortalità coi prieghi tuoi, che al sommo piacere si li dispieghi. Ancora ti prego, Regina, che puoi ciò che tu vuoi, che conservi sani, dopo tanto veder, gli affetti suoi. Vinca tua guardia i movimenti umani. Vedi, Beatrice, con quanti beati per i miei prieghi ti chiudo le mani. Gott aus dem Monat.